Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ah, mon frère, doucement. Hein? Oui, oui, vous avez la déclaration.
Any more news about the press conference from Colombia?
No.
Can I say?
Listen, we're going to go on finance. So I've just put in, I'll go on I'll just say something about
That's
of
fine.
debt
That's fine.
and
That's
tax.
fine.
Okay?
Okay, yeah, I'm talking a little bit about debt, but that's fine. Just go. Yeah.
Just so, because you'll all talk, so I've dropped in.
Good morning. Welcome to the press conference by Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. My name is Rachita, and I begin by voluntarily declaring that none of us have any ties with any fossil fuel industries, big agricultural companies, high emission industries, or any Zionist entities. 33 years ago, here in this very country, the governments and people's power gave birth to UNFCCC with a simple mandate: to stop the climate crisis by cutting emissions at the source and delivering real support to those most affected. 33 years later, we find ourselves back in Brazil, and instead of delivering climate action, the institution born here has been turned into a playground for global North power. The same governments who present themselves as climate leaders on the world stage continue to bully, block, weaken, and sabotage the negotiations behind closed doors. And the pattern is clear: no new finance, no real action. Any roadmap without real public grant-based finance is hollow. Any transition without means of implementation is empty shell. And any COP outcome that shifts responsibility onto the global south is a betrayal of the Convention and Paris Agreement itself. This press conference is about what we have gained and what we are losing, what is at stake for our communities, our commons, and our futures. DCJ's role at these talks has always been to cut through the noise, to explain what these texts actually mean for people on the front lines, and to sound the alarm when the governments try to rewrite the rules of fairness and responsibility. Today, the halls of COP30 are buzzing with excitement and anxiety over the new package of texts. And what we see is a coordinated effort by the EU and Umbrella Group to shift the burden onto the developing countries while blocking progress on every issue that actually matters for survival. But there is also resistance. The bold fight from the developing countries, backed by civil society across the world, has prevented some of the worst outcomes and kept alive the demand for equity, for real finance, and for transitions rooted in justice. This is a collective analysis of the text, of the politics, and the path ahead, because what happens here in Belém will shape the climate justice struggles for years to come. We'll hear from our first speaker now, Meena Raman from Third World Network.
Good morning. First of all, we are at the final hours of adopting a package of decisions. And for those of you who are wondering what's happening, the texts were released early this morning. Many of us have been looking at it, and also governments are looking at it. We understand that there will be consultations happening on what's called the Mutirao text. This is the Global Mutirao, Uniting Humanity in a Global Mobilization Against Climate Change. Just for clarity, this involves 4 main issues, but I will highlight one of the biggest issues has been the issue of the provision of finance under what's called the Article 9.1 of the agreement. Now, as Rachita had pointed out, one of the biggest sticky issues throughout the process in the whole history of the 33 years and also the 10 years of the Paris Agreement has to put real money on the table in terms of real provision of finance. Last year, at the new collective quantified goal on finance, what we saw was only a goal of 300 billion per year to be delivered by 2035. But the needs determination report of the UNFCCC clearly showed that what developing countries need for their current NDCs, this is not even taking into account the new NDCs which are on the table, was already in the realm of 5.1 trillion to 6.8 trillion, up until 2030. And then for adaptation finance, it was in the area of 215 to 387 billion by 2030. These are huge numbers. What we landed last year was a miserable 300 billion per year that the developed countries say was a mobilizing of finance, which will be from all sources, from the MDBs, from the private sector, which will also probably include loans, which means getting developing countries into more debt, and also export credits, because this is exactly what happened in the 100 billion roadmap that they had before this new goal. So we come here, and the developing countries under the Group of 77 and China have been pushing. This has always been about ambition on emission reductions, don't forget adaptation, don't forget loss and damage. And then you have the means of implementation. As Rachita said, you can have all the roadmaps in the world, but if you do not have a roadmap on the real meaningful delivery of the provision of finance, these will be empty roadmaps and roadmaps to nothing. So this is where developing countries came here with the hope that there would be something meaningful. And what have we got? All we have got is a 2-year work program to talk about how we are going to be doing the provision of Article 9.1 with the provision of finance, but in the context of Article 9. What that means is, it's not about provision alone, it's about the mobilization, it's about the private sector, it's about the MDBs. This is not what the conversation we wanted to have, because we wanted to have a clear discussion on the political framing, the political space to discuss what's being provided, because don't fudge. Now, my colleagues will talk about what is the problem in terms of what the global north is going through, so I won't touch that. So that's one very important aspect. So although in the text we have a work program for 2 years, it's not all the way that we wanted, but it is a very important recognition of Article 9.1. So the developed world should not be allowed to fudge anymore. You cannot fudge. You need to address this, and that is a 2-year work program, which is another fight that we will continue to battle in the next 2 years. The other is the adaptation finance. This was a huge battle. In Glasgow, there was a decision about doubling adaptation finance. I told you about the billions that we need on adaptation finance. In Glasgow, it was doubling the adaptation finance, which actually was unclear in terms of the actual amount, but what we understand was around the area of 40 billion. Today, it's in the text, in the Mutirao text, there is a text which says that adaptation finance has to be tripled from 2025 levels, and that's important. But yet, and this is by 2030, we will be, it's not, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know even this will have attempts to water down further. So the little that we have, which we see as moving forward, will be watered down even further. Of course, there is a win on the Just Transition Work Program. I will let my colleagues deal with that. That's a very important, significant win. But none of these mechanisms mean anything if there is no money that really translates into the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Fund for Loss and Damage, the Global Environment Facility, and you just can't shift it to the MDBs and the private sector. So as far as we are concerned, there are, it's like taking the horse to the water. You can't make it drink. But it was such a huge and phenomenal struggle to get where we are. Very little in terms of some glimmer of hope. But what we worry about is whether this glimmer of hope for further battles to come will actually be obliterated. So we wait for that to be seen, and we certainly hope that the final outcome will be something that is better and not further diluted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meena. We'll now hear from Lady Nakpil from Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development.
Well, first of all, I'd like to refer to Rachita's disclaimer at the beginning of the session that we are not from fossil fuel corporations or related to any of them. In fact, we are very active and committed campaigners for the rapid, equitable, and just transition out of fossil fuels directly into democratic, renewable energy systems without false solutions. I'm saying this because I'm going to refer to this whole controversial issue about the roadmap for the fossil fuel transition, or the transitioning away from fossil fuels. We know that this has been such a controversial issue, and many parties debating this well into the night. We know that a roadmap that has very clear targets and timelines, with very clear indicators of what climate finance is needed and where it's going to come from, and with a very clear just transition dimension, is urgently needed. But that was not what was at stake in this debate. We welcomed the efforts of Brazil and Colombia, for instance, to raise this roadmap as one of the concerns and agenda of this COP. But we know that the global north, or the governments of developed countries, is exercising sheer climate hypocrisy by acting as advocates for these roadmaps, but actually conducting themselves in the opposite back in their countries. They are the ones leading in the financing and expansion of fossil fuels in the South and globally. They are the largest consumers of fossil fuel energy. So it is absolutely disgusting how they have been playing themselves out as climate champions and pushing for this roadmap. The hypocrisy is also very clearly seen in the contradiction between pushing for a roadmap and the refusal to talk about, much less deliver, climate finance that is needed to make it possible, or refusing to give any good future to the Just Transition Work Program, because we had to fight many battles to even make sure the work program continues, and now we are getting, and Assad will deal with that, getting some good results for the many years of efforts in pushing for a global just transition mechanism. This kind of playing out of the drama in this COP, it is not therefore surprising that many developing country governments, and we have to clarify, this is not about the petrostates being against the roadmap. Many developing country governments are refusing to have a roadmap that is empty, that is not clearly having the vital elements that to make it a meaningful roadmap, their refusal to have it in the text. So it is not surprising for us. We caution against a very simplistic and very duplicitous narrative that will spring out of this dynamics that will say global north is being ambitious and it's the global south that is halting or being obstacles or barriers to ambition. So we just want to remind the world that there is no one who has the greatest stake in a rapid, equitable, and just transition out of fossil fuels than the people and the countries of the global south. We cannot be any less ambitious. We are more ambitious than anyone else, but we are also insisting that to be ambitious means to also be realistic about the requirements for ambition. And we are not begging for this climate finance for ourselves. We are demanding this climate finance because the future of the entire planet and all of humanity is at stake. This is not just about our welfare as people of the global south. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liddy. We'll next hear from Brandon Wu from ActionAid USA.
Thank you. Mina and Liddy both spoke really powerfully on finance, and I'm going to do the same thing because it really is at the crux of why these negotiations are stuck in all the places that they are. I've said it before, I'll say it again, on delivering climate finance to the global south. The global north countries have failed, are failing, and even worse, they're planning to continue failing. And we can see that across all the negotiation texts. If you look at the new, some of the new texts, like the multi-RAO text, on loss and damage, for example. So we've heard about why finance is so important for the just transition. It's also really important to support communities facing impacts. We need adaptation finance. We need finance for loss and damage. There was language in the previous multi-RAO text expressing concern that the new fund for responding to loss and damage didn't have enough money. That text has disappeared. In its place is text that developed countries pushed, basically saying, welcomes the decision of the fund board to establish a replenishment cycle, and we look forward to a successful replenishment of the fund for responding to loss and damage. This is gaslighting of the first order, right? This is developed countries just pretending that they're gonna do anything when they have absolutely no intention to do so, which we know from decades of history. On adaptation finance, as Mina said, we have a tripling of adaptation finance. That was actually one of our demands, but it's a tripling from a baseline of 2025 levels. We don't even know what 2025 levels are. We won't know that for 2 years, but there are already estimates from Oxfam and others that because of the trends in foreign assistance, because of the United States doing whatever it's doing, adaptation finance levels are going to be significantly lower in 2025 than they have been in years past. And so that's the baseline likely that we're going to be working from. So again, this is like a false promise from developed countries. Instead of providing real assurance to developing countries that finance is going to come to enable a just transition, to protect communities, they are distracting with false solutions. So we have this whole thing around $1 billion coming to the TFFF forest facility, which is money to invest in capital markets, and then spare change is going to be provided to communities. We've got an insistence that money come from multilateral development banks. 12% of multilateral development bank finance comes in the form of grants. So that's the trend. 2/3 of all climate finance that's been provided is in the form of loans, and the majority of those are not even concessional loans. Most of them are market rate loans. This is not climate finance. We have at least 54 countries in the global south that are in debt crisis. We know that when countries are in debt, they're forced into extractive activities to generate the ability to have foreign currency to pay off those debts. There's this debt climate cycle. So any kind of climate finance that comes in the form of increased indebtedness is not solving the problem, and of course is not just. So if we look at, again, coming back to the sort of headline issue of today, look at some of the northern countries that are talking about a fossil fuel roadmap, talking about how we're not going to accept an outcome here without more ambition on fossil fuels. A lot of those countries, or actually none of those countries, are on track to phase out fossil fuels on time. They're not providing finance to enable the phase out in the global south. They are demanding everything and they're providing nothing.
Thank you so much, Brandon. We now hear from our last speaker, Saad Rahman from Friends of the Earth Uni. UK.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Rashida. My name's Asad Raymond from Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We welcome the progress made on the Just Transition Work Programme. Very rare that we sit here and we say we welcome something, but I think it's important to recognise that this shift did not happen on its own. It was a result of sustained pressure from civil society, especially from groups in the UK, alongside G77 and global movements, who've insisted that the just transition must be at the heart of the COP process. And their insistence has moved developed countries, including the UK, from a position of resisting and blocking to the beginning of an outcome. So we're encouraged to see that the Just Transition Mechanism, which draws from our call for a Belém action mechanism, is now on the table and explicitly recognises the principles for a just, equitable and ecological transition. That includes alignment with ILO standards, the UN Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection, for just transitions, UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the protection of indigenous peoples' rights. Fundamental pillars without which any transition will be unjust, inequitable and unsustainable. So the principles of equity and justice must now remain intact. And of course, in the coming hours and behind closed doors, what we cannot allow is developed countries, led by the UK and others, to water this down into another empty outcome. This was a red line for the G77. It was a red line for civil society across the world as well. And we will continue to make sure that in Bonn next year, we have the right process so that COP31 can adopt the Belém action mechanism. We will continue to demand from workers to all marginalised people, and not only in the room, but are at the table, designing a transition for people, by people, and a transition that is not just done to people. A transition not just from fossil fuels, but one where our economies and societies address climate, nature depletion, and our economic inequality, so that we can ensure that everyone has a right to live with dignity and in harmony with our planet. And I just want to say, we've heard a lot from my colleagues about finance. And of course, we know that a text on transition, whilst welcome, we must consider and confront the central issue that shapes every negotiation: finance. And we keep saying to developed countries, they have such a myopic view of finance, that without finance, just transition pathways are little more than words on paper. And just to build on what Brendan and Mina and Lydie set out, look, we know that we already know that developing countries are paying on an average of $1.4 trillion every year in debt servicing. In some countries, that's 47% of their national budgets. In parts of Africa, that increases to 55%. How can any government deliver climate ambition or a just transition when half of its revenue is flowing out in debt repayments? At the same time, we know that unfair international tax rules drain public resources, the very resources that are needed to be able to fund sustainable development and climate action. Every year, multinational corporations shift profits and avoid $311 billion in taxes to developing countries. That the super rich, at the lowest estimate, are hiding between 169 billion in offshore. That's why so many countries and global civil society have called for a UN tax convention where global tax are fair, inclusive and transparent, and that where we can see wealth taxes and corporation tax. And it is hypocritical for countries like the UK to be talking about global finance here whilst blocking progress at the UN Tax Convention. And that would liberate the many hundreds of billions that is needed for both climate finance and just transition. We know developing countries need real climate fiscal space. And when developed countries like the UK are cutting their overseas development aid, are claiming empty coffers, it's not lost on us that this never comes into consideration when we're talking about increased military spending or when we're talking about increasing subsidies to both fossil fuels and big agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad. We'll now open for questions from the floor. Prioritizing media, please raise your hands. The mic will come to you. Please introduce yourself with your name and organization as you ask your question. Any questions?
Hi, I'm Damien Gale from The Guardian. The narrative that we've heard this morning is that progress is actually being blocked by Saudi Arabia and the like-minded developing countries. How do you respond to those claims?
Thanks, Damien. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you, Damien. I'm not sure what deficiencies that are being referred to, but the scapegoating of Saudi Arabia and the like-minded is nothing new. And I think if they are referring to the fossil fuel roadmap, and I think as has been explained, this is something that came out of nowhere without any negotiation. It's never been part of a negotiated outcome. So as parties here, I know this for a fact, it wasn't just the like-minded, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia, there were many countries from Africa, there were many countries from Latin America who all went to see the COP30 presidency and said, where is this coming from and why is this being introduced here when it's not negotiated? Of course, the Lula presidency has every right to include this and show ambition in a declaration or anything that it's the initiative of President Lula or even the initiative of Colombia. But when it is supposed to be landed in a negotiated outcome, when countries do not know what exactly that means and where it will take them, and especially for a large number of countries, there is no roadmap on the finance, there is, even in the technology implementation program, there is no recognition of finance for the technology implementation program. So how do you do the fossil fuel, transitioning away from fossil fuel roadmap when it is not clear how you're going to be implementing? So stop scapegoating, and I think this is scapegoating. This is calling the LMDC out purely because they are convenient. They are convenient sources to be bashed. But as my colleagues have said, the real problem is that the real fossil fuel expansion is happening in the global north. And maybe one other point while I have the floor. The US has exited the Paris Agreement. Donald Trump is drill baby drilling. The EU is continuing to expand. The whole world, like some of them said, if you want a real roadmap on fossil fuels, why can't the developed world do a roadmap on fossil fuels? Because the decision from Dubai was in a just, orderly and equitable way. And in the Paris Agreement, it says developed countries take the lead. It is not reflected in their NDCs. Why aren't they taking the lead? So why do they come here, pretend to be hypocrites, and blame others? This is all about blame game, and we cannot have that. So for a fact, we are not defending the Saudis or the like-minded, but we know the realities on the ground. As Lydie said, we campaign back home, but it's really hard to campaign back home on a transition when there is not enough money for the transition.
Thanks, Meena. Brandon, and then Asad.
Yeah, just very, very quickly to add, this is actually very similar to a conversation we were having in Dubai, as Meena referenced. In this case, it's not just Saudi Arabia that has concerns. They have concerns for their own reasons, but also most of the Africa group, we understand, has concerns. And I'm recalling a couple years ago a press conference the Africa group did when we were talking about exactly this fossil fuel phase out, and they said, we want a fossil fuel phase out, but it is political and economic suicide to promise a fossil fuel phase out without knowing that there's finance and support coming from the global north. And so again, I think there are many countries that have very legitimate concerns about both process and substance here. And finally, yes, on the United States, even before the Trump administration took power, the US had the largest oil and gas expansion plans of any country in the world.
Right. Thanks, Brandon. Asad, and then Lydie.
Yeah, just to add, I think we all know, look, roadmaps that only focus on missions or on vague phase-down languages are roadmaps to nowhere. I mean, what we really need here, and if we wanted to unlock that, would be a roadmap on finance, because The key to ambition is finance. The key to a just transition is finance. The key to fossil phase out is finance. And without a clear commitment from developed countries to provide that, that transition and that exit will not happen at the scale or the speed required. And it's no good for rich developed countries to stand on platforms saying we want a fossil fuel phase out and then refusing to actually take the concrete steps. The concrete steps, even if they were supporting the Colombia plan, which would recognise that economies need to diversify, that would recognise that many of the developing countries are trapped in debt crisis, and that you need adequate and sustainable and real public finance to enable them to exit and transition away from fossil fuels. So if we're serious, let's get behind that. We are all campaigners on fossil fuels, on ending the addiction to deadly fossil fuels. But we also believe in the right of people to live with dignity. We have to be able to do these two things at the same time.
Thanks, Asad. Lydie, the last point.
Yeah. The COP presidency said this is supposed to be a COP of truth. And this is a very important and vital example of false news. We need to scratch under the surface to see what is really playing out. It's not a new story or dynamic. We've seen this across the years, the global north as the climate champions, the global south that are the ones that are standing in the way of progress. But we have to understand the real issues behind. So I would not add anything more except to say it's a more difficult story to tell, but the truth has to be the story that must be told.
Thanks, Lydie.
Thank you.
We just want to close by saying that we'll do a press huddle somewhere in the afternoon when the new text comes out, so around this area, and also there's no climate justice without Palestinian liberation. Thank you.